Thank you, Ken, for joining this interview of the DR pioneers. How did you actually initially get engaged in DRR work? You told me you were already in the early 70s active in the field, and it was quite a lonesome business.
Yes, it was a lonesome business. I suppose in a way I was I accidentally got involved in disaster risk reduction because I was quite lazy as an undergraduate, and I was presented with a list of topics to do for my dissertation in human geography, and when I came to choose my topic, it was in fact there were 2 left out of 28. So I chose one of those 2, and the one I chose as seeming to be most interesting was the human geography of earthquake zones in Europe. Mm-hmm. And so I started to research that as my undergraduate dissertation and got very interested in the literature. And I was very lucky in being at Bradford University at that time, because just after I graduated, or just as I graduated, one of the departments of the university was establishing a disaster research unit. And I was approached on the day of my graduation and asked if I would like to join the unit. They were looking for a research student, somebody who could apply for a government grant. And I applied for that grant, and we were successful. And so I began my master's and my involvement with the disaster research unit, which I suppose has been the stimulus for my entire working life.
Okay, and was Bradford the first university to have, in the UK, to have shown interest in this topic of risk reduction, or was it also, I mean, was there a broader field engaged on the academic world, or not?
There was a broader field, but what we were doing in looking at vulnerability rather than at the agents of disaster was probably fairly unique. We were guided by, really, I suppose, some different schools of academic activity, such as schools of geography in the States at Clark University, people like Robert Cates and Ian Burton and Gilbert White in Colorado, who were looking at things like the way communities adjusted and adapted to threats and crisis. And also, I was very involved in trying to understand the developments in sociology in the United States under Henry Quarantelli and Russell Dines and Bob Anderson and people like that. So part of the work I did during my master's was to actually research the literature to the point where I produced a bibliography. So I got to know the literature very well, and that literature actually provided me again with a fair foundation for what came next. But they weren't actually looking at the issues we were looking, but they provided a lot of input. And we also came at it from, I would say, pretty much a Marxist perspective, looking at marginalization. We didn't use the word vulnerability to start with. In fact, that word came later. We were fighting for words, trying to find the right words. In fact, at one point we used the word proneness, which is a clumsy word, and that even found its way into one of the occasional papers that we wrote at Bradford. But you know, eventually it settled down, and we had a nomenclature that we could use. But the words that we used were very much experimental in the early days.
So you were almost shaping a field that was still to be further developed, and
yes,
and disaster risk reduction as a term did not yet exist at that time, or?
No, it didn't. It didn't exist at that time. In fact, it came much later. I was interested to hear the Undersecretary, the head of DRR, of the UNDRR, say last year that we should not talk about natural disasters anymore. Well, that's approximately 45 years since we made it clear that you shouldn't be talking about natural disasters. We wrote an article that appeared in Nature that was titled "Taking the Naturalness Out of Natural Disasters," and that was 1976.
That's amazing
So
that this still for debate, and you see often the word natural disasters popping up in a lot of even UN publications and World Bank publications again. So it seems like you have to time and time again stress that certain insights of the past are very valuable. No,
you do. And as soon as you say natural disasters, you've nailed your colours to the mast, as they say. You've told us where you're coming from, and you know, and it's very much it was very much a key issue for us to identify that we're not talking about some natural event. We're talking about a natural trigger, but we're talking about a natural trigger that affected human populations. And that dimension of human populations was absolutely vital to understanding disaster risk.
Was this the main lesson or insight you gained in these early days, which is still of value today, or were there others as well?
I think that was the principal one. I mean, that was the issue that, and of course that led to discussions of the relationship between disaster risk and development, and the understanding that actions you take as a population, as a government, have repercussions on the way disaster affects you. The socioeconomic status of your population has a bearing on how disasters affect you. And so it was all looking at the other side of the equation rather than focusing on the disaster agent as such, at a time when most agencies and governments were playing the role of cavalry and rushing to disaster scenes and distributing aid and relief in great quantities and in a very competitive environment, let me say, to ensure that people are sustained, but not necessarily in sustaining them. They didn't actually focus on looking at their vulnerability and how that could be reduced over time.
In your early career, you worked both for Oxfam and IFRC, two organizations which nowadays are known to be able to bridge their humanitarian response work to development and then have DRR as a kind of interacting element. Was this already the case when you joined Oxfam or IFRC, or were you one of the pioneers trying to inject it, or didn't you get anybody listening to you?
Oxfam, I think Oxfam there was always a fertile environment at Oxfam to discuss and listen to issues of this kind, even if the organization as a whole wasn't particularly moving in that direction. It had built its reputation to a great extent on its disaster response, Oxfam. And there were several key elements of Oxfam as an organization which were heavily focused on disaster response. So it was very difficult, if you like, to integrate that very productive and very effective part of Oxfam's work with the development work. But I think certainly within the environment in Oxfam, there was a broader thinking. In the IFRC, probably not so much. They sent me out to Sudan, and in Sudan, I started looking at ways in which we could bring, because I went out mainly because of a major famine that was occurring in Sudan at the time. And I was interested in looking at ways in which we could involve communities in making decisions about relief and development in relation to the aid that we gave them, rather than just mounting a straightforward relief operation. But that wasn't necessarily you know, totally acceptable. I was sometimes accused of being heartless by not focusing on distributing large quantities of food. But it was, it took Oxfam, it took the Red Cross a long time, I think, to really understand it. And of course, when I was there in 2007 for a couple of years, the issue started to be quite significant in the way that the Red Cross responds to disasters. I don't think necessarily they've been consistent since, though, I have to say.
Okay, but after the Ethiopia famine, at least within the Red Cross, there was more a realization that we should no longer just focus on food handouts, and that we would have to address the root causes. But that did not permeate in your work when you were in Sudan or Tanzania, or?
It did not permeate, and if it permeated at all, and this is a big issue for me over the years, it didn't permeate much beyond preparedness. And as we know, disaster risk reduction is much more than that. Organizations of this kind are very often, they're happy, they're comfortable with preparedness, they understand it, they know what it means. Beyond that, it gets more complex. And it gets more difficult to identify roles. And governments don't help either, because governments encourage preparedness and response. They don't necessarily think they have disaster risk management offices, but those offices are mainly the government's conduits for relief and preparedness, not much more than that.
No. And then after your IFRC period, you made a major career move, being the director of the Disaster Management Center in Cranfield. How did that happen, and how did you experience that?
Oh, I think I was headhunted. The previous director of the center was looking for somebody to take over from him when he retired. And he found me in Tanzania, where I was working for IFRC, and he encouraged me back. And within a year, he'd retired, and I became director of that center. That center was also had some. It was a paradox that we were also at the same time promoting a development-focused agenda, but at the same time we were providing quite a strong focus on response, because the disaster research unit was based at the Royal Military College of Science in Shrivenham, and at a time when the defense forces thought they had a role, as you know, peace seemed to be breaking out everywhere in those days, and they wanted a role, and they saw their role very much as supporting the emergency response in times of disaster. And so we had to try and balance one against the other. It's certainly because we were expecting to earn our money from clients who perhaps had a response focus rather than a development focus.
But there was still a lot of training going on in Cranfield, also of people from developing countries. I mean, quite a few people I know have had their first let's say, exposure to DRR and more developmental thinking at Cranfield. No?
Yeah, that happened in two ways. We had an annual course in the UK, which ran every summer, and we had about 30 to 35 students each time for that course from across the world. And then we would take courses back to those countries, and so there was a lot of in-country training. And that training also had a fair variety of approaches. We had on our staff, we had senior policemen, we had ex-military, we had public health nurses. We had a variety of people who had a variety of interests. And we had to try and cover all those interests at the same time as trying to push an objective, which was to look at disaster risk more comprehensively than just from a response perspective.
Mm-hmm. In these 30 years since you started till 2000, which we say is probably the end of the early day period before ISDR was established, how did you see the field evolve in terms of its concepts, in terms of its thinking? And I mean, you said you were very lonesome at the beginning of the 70s. Did you still feel like we were dealing with quite a marginalized field at the end of the millennium, or did it gain importance?
No, I didn't. Certainly, organizations like UNDP had started to grasp the importance of a more. They recognized in the early 1990s that if what they were doing in development was to be sustainable, then they had to do something about these disasters that were constantly wrecking the work that they were doing. And if you remember, during the 1990s, they ran this disaster management training program, which was a global program, essentially and initially for UN staff. They wanted UN staff to understand the development priority in disaster risk reduction. And but then, of course, it opened up to governments. And we were responsible at Cranfield for running the Africa component of that program. Mm. And so we were visiting many different countries in Africa and running national workshops in which we were trying to promote the broader development perspective in relation to disaster and disaster risk. And of course, by the turn of the millennium, as we moved into UNISDR, UNDP played a major role, and eventually I found my place within that structure as well.
Okay, and when I mean, you're still active in the field. When you look at it in 2020, I mean, how do you see the field of DRR in terms of its new features or heritage of the past, and what changes did you notice, for the good or the bad, since you started?
I've got a lot more kindred spirits now than I had before, such as yourself, Bruno, and many others. So there's a lot of people who speak the same language now. That's fine, and I'm very, very happy with that. Very happy with that. I still think there's a long way to go, and I go back to what I said about the head of UN DRR saying that we shouldn't talk about natural disasters only last year. So we've got a long way to go, I mean, for that message to get across, for a start. And I still think there's a heavy emphasis in DRR on preparedness. I still don't think we've got there. I think governments are reluctant. Governments like the headlines, and I'm afraid development-focused disaster risk reduction is not a headline for them. So elements such as mainstreaming disaster risk reduction in development and across the sectors is probably not happening at the kind of pace that I would like to see. And I find too, other elements are disturbing. There's still a lot too much competitiveness among agencies for funding, which leads to, I think, sometimes wrong decisions or bad decisions being taken, and sometimes too a duplication of effort. And I still think that we have, I think globally, across government particularly, we have a tendency to rely on the thoughts and the approaches of people who come from a more logistics background than from a development background. I thought to myself the other day, whenever I was going into a country to talk about disaster risk management, nobody ever introduced me to the Ministry of Planning. I was taken straight to the disaster risk management or disaster management unit, as if to say, that's my natural home. And in many instances, it wasn't my natural home, because my natural home was to talk development with the guys that do it on a day-to-day basis from a policy and planning perspective. And I never met those ministers of planning, but they are absolutely vital to this mainstreaming issue. And I think too that I've just recently been in Bangladesh leading a project to train people in basically emergency response. And I took that job primarily because I thought I could have some influence. And that project was funded by the World Bank, who should know better. Because what they were doing were training an elite. The community, population as a whole, even civil society wasn't necessarily involved in that project from the start. And it was about, you know, how many people you could give certificates to, and how many people you could send on international training, how many people you could link up with international organizations that are promoting disaster response. It's all that kind of thing, and nothing much about how people can react and respond on the ground. I am very, very grateful that the word resilience has come into our vocabulary these days. That word resilience, I think, is very useful, provided we understand it and interpret it in the correct way. I think it's a very useful concept for us to have as a focus in our minds for much of the work that we do.
Why is that so important? Because it's also something that people see as a negative term. I mean, moving away from vulnerability, but you're saying it is actually an added value to the field of DRR.
I'm saying it's an added value from an ownership point of view. I mean, we are not responsible for anybody else's resilience. They're responsible for their own, and resilience means you can cope, you can deal with these issues. And from an ownership point of view, community resilience, I think, is a very, very important concept. And it's something that we should be looking to stimulate, rather than just, I think, the reduction of vulnerability is too narrow, because I think what we're talking about now is much more than that. Maybe in the early days it suited, but now I think it's much too narrow. And I think you know, looking at and encouraging communities to develop and build and strengthen their own resilience. They all know something about disaster, particularly if they've experienced it before. And that's the starting point for me. And that's the starting point for building and strengthening stronger communities.
You didn't mention climate issues being now very much a important field for DRR to consider, to the extent even that climate adaptation is taking, or partly taking, over the DRR field, as well as some nature-based solutions. Do you think this is good news, or there's also some risks and challenges involved?
Well, for all those people that experience earthquakes, it's not going to be of much value. But I mean, I think it's helpful from the perspective that it actually emphasizes the issues, because there's no doubt about it, we're in a period of climate change. I didn't mention it because for me, dealing with climate change for many people is the same thing as dealing with disaster risk. So there isn't a lot of difference. And I tend not to make that difference, you know, from the work that I do. But understanding that it's an issue at the top of the agenda for many governments and many organizations these days, it is very important to remember that probably 80% of climate change adaptation is about disaster risk reduction. And that therefore the disaster risk reduction agenda deserves to have a pride of place in developing and providing the policy framework and the strategies to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe to conclude, what do you see in your career, and specifically focusing on the early 3 decades, what were your major achievements? Now, I mean, we're in a stage, both of us, when we look back and we say, oh, well, we're proud of this and that, but we could have done better in this and that. When you look at your own career, like you're very proud of or happy with, or what will be your personal legacy, if I can say so?
That's difficult because I haven't really thought about that. My legacy, I'm not a natural academic. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't follow the path of some of my illustrious colleagues. And I really have some wonderful friends out there among the academic community. People like Ian Davis and Phil O'Keefe and Ben Wisner. And they were far more natural academics than I was. I felt that the role I could play most effectively was to be a bridge between those academics and the practice. And that's what I tried to do. And I believe that I was able to do it certainly in some of the field work that I did, particularly in Sudan, and maybe in Uganda. Most of my field work was done in Africa. In fact, I was working in Africa for most of the initial period of my life, certainly during that period up to the year 2000. So I feel that my achievement is to try and is to using that bridge between the academics and the practice to get it on the agendas of international organizations and governments. And if I've managed to do that in any case that I have been a part of, then I would have been happy. I will be happy, certainly.
Who are your main influencers? I mean, you mentioned some of the American academics, but are there other people you would say this you definitely have to interview so and so because they have been really key in the early days of DRR?
Yeah, some of them, of course, you can't interview because they've passed away. Others you will interview. I mean, I have to give credit especially to Ian Davis. He's contributed to my life from the mid-70s, and I know him personally as a friend, but also as a great encouragement in what I have done, and a great source of knowledge and insight. So he was very important. Of course, Phil O'Keefe and Ben Wisner, my partners at Bradford. Sorry, I said Bradford, I meant Cranfield, the Disaster Management Center. I said it was Bradford. The Bradford team, Ben, Phil and myself, we lived in each other's pockets for about 3 years. I mean, it was just incredibly fertile as an environment. And the other person I would point to, who sadly is also not with us, is Fred Cuny. Fred wrote that groundbreaking book, Disasters and Development. And while it didn't necessarily cover the ground that we later would have wanted it to, it certainly raised the issue and established disasters and development as something that was worth looking at and worth studying. Fred was a great motivator, I have to say. I nearly worked for Fred twice. I'm very pleased that I didn't, because I think I would have got into an awful lot of trouble. Fred was a real character, but he was certainly a very, very important influence early on in my career. So yes, those others like Henry Quarantelli, who I didn't know that well, and I didn't meet that often. I mean, I'm talking really about people I met a lot. Fred I met quite often. And Ian, of course, I was with quite a lot of the time, and of course Ben and Phil. But Henry Quarantelli was certainly a pretty big influence on my career too, particularly, as I say, in the early days. Each generation does not want to listen to what happened before, because they have to establish themselves. And what they can't do, what they can't afford to do, is to establish themselves on the back of what's happened before. They need to have something, promote something new. And in each generation of actors in DRR, there is a need amongst individuals to be stars, to actually fly their flag, because they need to be noticed in order to take steps in their career. And therefore it is something, they have to say something new, which isn't necessarily connected with what's gone on before. It's not necessarily that linear progression that you mentioned before, which is so important to the field and to it working effectively.
So there's a lack of willingness to learn from the past, or to some extent, or?
No, I just think, I think back to when I was first starting, and I think there may have been part of me that was a bit reluctant to listen to what happened before. Mind you, our interpretation was that not a lot had happened before. So at least we were on in a fertile, reasonably fertile environment. But I have to say, I go back again to the point that I made about the head of UNDRR saying that we shouldn't call it natural disasters. This is precisely what I'm talking about. We should have got over that a long time ago. That should have been out the window. That shouldn't even be an issue anymore. But it still is. Just as, you know, we've talked about preparedness, the dominance of preparedness is an issue. Hyogo framework, five priorities. Everybody goes for one. Priority number 5. Forget about the rest. That's the one we know and understand. We don't want anything else. That's it. We can do that. We know that. So we'll do it. We'll do it. And it's the same with Sendai. There's one priority that is probably emphasized more than others.
Is there a role for the pioneers to? Is there a role for the pioneers to be protecting these old insights to some extent?
I hope so. I hope so, and I hope what you're doing with these interviews and the publication that will come out of it, I hope they play a role, because it's very important. I don't think that I have actually philosophically moved on from where I was in 1976.
Okay.
I mean, philosophically, I'm not talking about the detail. I'm talking about overall, philosophically, I've not moved on I've not moved on. Not that I perhaps shouldn't have done. Maybe I should have moved on. But the point I'm making is I see a relevance in what I was talking about then, even now. And maybe even more so now than before. Because these, particularly with climate change as the driver, we're not going to be in a period where these things are going to decrease in their intensity and in their frequency.
So it's a good feeling to know that you were right almost 50 years ago, and that all your thoughts are still very helpful and relevant up to today. So you worked for a good cause. And there's still a lot of work to do.
I'm far too modest. I'm far too modest to admit to that. But if people want to look at what we wrote, and I have to say, if I look back on the number of publications that are still referencing the articles that we wrote in the 1970s, that's still regularly a reference document. Articles from 76 and 77 are still very much referenced by writers today as they come to terms with and try to understand issues around vulnerability and building resilience for the future.
Okay, thanks
No,
a lot,
terrific.
Ken. Bye.
Thanks, Bruno. I could do this all day.